Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep week 30 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, this series, we've been looking at the revised and expanded edition of Tolkien's Letters, edited by Humphrey Carpenter and Christopher Tolkien. It's time to keep going as I share and discuss some of the new content found only in this new edition of the volume. Now, last week, we looked at a really interesting letter that Tolkien wrote to his good friend and fellow scholar, E.V. Gordon, about his work on the Middle English poem Pearl. We ended with his thoughts on Kenneth Sizem, who fortunately is not mentioned in today's letters. Today, though, we're going to go back to some of those family letters, specifically a couple of letters to his son, Michael. Now, first, we have new letter 36A, written to Michael in March of 1939. Now, at this point, Michael is 18, and the poor guy's not feeling well. He's sick with a bad cold, and Tolkien writes to commiserate. He also admits that he has neglected you this term, as far as letters go, being crushingly busy. But I never ceased to think of you, and hope that you and all your friends go on well. He then tells Michael that he's preparing for a trip to Scotland early the following week, adding that he has not written the infernal lecture yet. Not much bed for me between then and now, I fear. To what infernal lecture is Tolkien referring? It's his lecture on fairy stories that he'll be delivering at the University of St. Andrews 1 week from the date of that letter. Now, a quick aside before we return to another letter to Michael. In September of 1939, Tolkien writes to his publisher about the proposed sequel to The Hobbit, which they'd asked about some 3 months prior. He writes, "I do not suppose this any longer interests you greatly, though I still hope to finish it eventually. It is only about 3/4 written." Really, Professor? 75% written some 16 years before publication? I love his optimism. Still, we're going to go ahead and go back to another letter to Michael, and this one is in July of 1940. Michael is now stationed with his regiment in a town just east of Oxford. Tolkien writes, "My beloved boy, I am so glad you wrote to me out of your heart. You and John and Christopher don't open out to me enough. You would probably usually get a spot of comfort if you did. I dare say with my jesting I am a bit forbidding and give the impression of being critical and apt to think things ridiculous. But it is not so, really." Kind of makes one think, what must it have been like for these boys growing up? How hard would it have been having one of the keenest minds giving you the impression of being critical? That would have been, I think, a really interesting challenge for those boys growing up. The rest of the letter is filled with fatherly advice, and I want to try to put myself in this young 19-year-old's shoes as I read the rest of this. Or, I don't know, since my son is almost 12, maybe I need to put myself in the professor's shoes as advice giver. It would seem that Michael at this time is seeing a young woman whose name begins with the letter A, no more is provided, and Tolkien wants to make it very clear that he does not feel that Michael's love for this young woman is ridiculous. He writes, "Nothing could be less ridiculous than a young man's feelings of that kind, even if it does not ripen into final love or end in marriage." Now, Tolkien does advise him not to make any permanent pledges because life is uncertain. And boy, in July 1940, that is very much the case. And Tolkien says that, except for very rare events in love, a good man is capable of loving more than one woman. The chances of life, or God, determine largely whom he shall fall in love with, and whom it will prove in the end possible for him to marry. I think I hear what he's saying, don't you? You're 19 years old, you're in love now, but you might change your mind, and she might as well, he notes. But love is most certainly not ridiculous, Tolkien tells his son. He even reminds Michael that I was less old than you when I met your mother, and I have remained faithful ever since. But that was not the first time I had felt in love. He also adds that he would never forbid him to write to this young woman, a memory I'm sure he recalls with great sorrow, having been forbidden for 3 years to even write to Edith. He goes on to sort of apologize for Edith's behavior towards Michael. In what comes across as, I don't know, let's just say insensitive, Tolkien argues that women are often far less introspective than men and apt to understand their own motives very little. Oddly, I find the opposite to be true more often than not, but I'm certainly not going there today. And I'm not sure that Tolkien should have gone there, but, you know. He goes on to point out how dear sons are to their mothers and that, quote, they feel a certain jealousy the jealousy of age for youth and of one woman for another competitor, which few of them are aware of and only the most saintly are able to control. Folks, I am not here to defend Tolkien on this one. I'm just here to tell you what he wrote, okay? It's a little... Well, let's just move on, shall we? Michael had apparently said something in his letter about feeling a sense of unworthiness, a sense of debt owed to his father. And Tolkien writes, "You can repay me as much as I could possibly ask by adhering to your faith and keeping yourself pure and sober, and by giving me your confidence. Every good father deserves the fraternal friendship of his sons when they grow up. But of course, from my point of view, I have done nothing but my plain duty, and that not too well. I have spoken far too little to you, and not made it as easy as I should for you to find my friendship." Man, my heart breaks for him there. I can understand the perspective that he's sharing here. I certainly don't want my son to grow up feeling like I've kept my friendship from him, you know? And yet I think, what do you mean you've only done the bare minimum as a father? Look at the letters from Father Christmas alone. But, he has high standards for himself, that's for sure. Tolkien concludes this letter with sobering words about the war. He says, "This is a desperately serious war. Last war, I often did not see my sweetheart and later wife for weeks and months. I only saw my brother about twice in 3 or 4 years. I was not even able to get to your mother for days when John was born and she was at death's door, just about the time of the Battle of Cambrai. War is a grim, hard, ugly business." Tolkien's tendency to self-deprecation shows up again when he says that his success in his career dealing with people is owed to the army, not that I was a successful officer, he says. He goes on to say that Michael and his brothers all seem to have a decent share of courage and guts. You owe that to your mother. I have a kind heart and my faith, otherwise I should not be much of a father. He ends as I hope to end all my letters to my children. I love you very much. Be of good heart, your own dear father. And folks, that wraps it up for this week's Tolkien Tuesday. Be sure to join me again next week as I return to some more letters, this time to Christopher. With few exceptions, most of the next 40-some letters are to Christopher, after all. Please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can support this show, get an ad-free feed, become a part of my content council, listen to a bonus episode each week, and a lot more. And join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. If you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications. Please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps and follow @Tolkien Times on all your social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.